All right, it is now past 6, so I'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the Oregon as Bygone Bison Range and Grizzly Country webcast. My name is Allie Fisher, and I'll be your MC for tonight. I'm currently the Climate and Communications Intern for Oregon Wild, but I'll soon be transitioning to a full-time position, which is very exciting. I am honored to introduce our very special guest, Ethan Shaw. Ethan is a naturalist and freelance outdoors and nature writer, hailing from Wisconsin and based in northeastern Oregon. He's fascinated by the natural history of all stripes, with special interest in landscape ecology, historical ecology, geomorphology, biogeography, and wilderness. Tonight, he will be talking about some iconic megafauna, the bison and grizzly, and their relationship to Oregon's wildlands. We're also joined today by our own Oregon Wild staffer, Danielle Moser, the Wildlife Program Coordinator. I would also like to include a land acknowledgement in this space. I would like to offer gratitude for the land itself and for those who have lived here in Oregon since time immemorial. Not just the forests, rivers, mountains, and deserts that those of us at Oregon Wild celebrate and work to conserve, but also places of art and industry, science, commerce, and community that are built upon these lands. I would like to acknowledge the continuing presence of Indigenous peoples on the land here today, as well as historical events, including colonial legacies and wrongdoings that have had long-lasting and current impacts. Additionally, a recording of this program will be emailed out tomorrow or the next day and will be posted on our website, oregonwild.org, in the Wild blog. Please enter your questions at any time. We usually do get a flood of questions at the end. So the sooner you get yours in, the easier it will be for me to organize those. If you did get a raffle ticket, thank you. Your support allows us to continue doing these presentations and the work that we do. The raffle will be open throughout this evening. So after the presentation, if you decide you'd like to enter, you can do that by finding this event on the oregonwild.org homepage. Winners will be selected soon and contacted by email to verify shipping addresses. Lastly, keep a lookout for our next webcast on May 26th, where we will be talking with 3 adventurers about Utah's wild landscapes, and the sign up for that is now online at oregonwild.org. Now I'll pass it off to Ethan.
Thanks, Allie. Let me get the screen sharing going. Okay. And 1 second. Okay, how's it looking? Hopefully good. Good, okay, excellent. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and definitely thank Oregon Wild for inviting me to talk about these 2 critters, 2 charismatic critters. I'm pretty fascinated by them, and it's a cool story. I'm going to cover a lot of ground, and I'm going to go as fast as I can, which is going to necessitate kind of skimming through some pretty interesting little subtopics and rabbit holes we could go down. But maybe in the questions, if you guys are interested, we can return to some of the topics. I also want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Cayuse, Nez Perce, Walla Walla, Umatilla people, and this is a place name out of the They Are Not Forgotten Place Names Atlas of the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla, which I highly recommend. Cayuse Nez Perce name referencing grizzlies in the vicinity of Baker City out here in Northeast Oregon. And that's kind of a good reminder that the people who have the deepest, fullest knowledge of both grizzlies and bison are really Oregon's native peoples. What I'm going to present is a very incomplete picture, most of which is really skewed toward the Euro-American perspective, although there is quite a bit of indigenous knowledge that is contained within that, but nonetheless it's filtered through Euro-American commentators. And so the real important work on this ongoing project, I'm not an expert on this, other people are also looking into these historical ecologies and traditional native knowledge is got to be a priority going forward for deeper insights and perspective. So having said that, I will move forward here. I'm going to first talk about bison, mainly because bison disappeared earlier than grizzlies from Oregon. They existed in lower numbers, and we don't know quite as much about bison in the state. There's sort of a fleeting ghostly presence in the historical record, and they probably were in the when they actually existed in the state too, to some extent, as we'll get into. Bison evolution, super fascinating topic that we simply can't go into here, but for a little bit of context, bison probably reached North America about 150,000 years ago or so in the form of the steppe bison, which you see on the left there. And they came to North America, Pleistocene North America that was full of all kinds of megafauna, really diverse roster of big mammals, ungulates and carnivores. And they diversified once they arrived here into various forms, including on the right there, you see the giant longhorned bison, which was the biggest and obviously a super impressive animal. Would have been very amazing to see in the flesh. But long story short, bison managed to survive the late Pleistocene, early Holocene megafaunal extinctions that wiped out most of those other large mammals. Bison really are a survivor. And ever since, from the late Pleistocene onward, basically bison got smaller and smaller into the modern American bison, which are represented by two subspecies, the plains bison and the wood bison, which are the biggest native land mammals in North America, but nonetheless, they are the smallest of that North American bison line. Jumping way forward in time, this is a depiction by a map by David Matson, who I'll talk more about once we get to the grizzly bears. But this is a map showing essentially the range of the plains bison in North America, roughly at the time of European colonization / occupation of the continent. There's a lot of information on here, but really what's most important is kind of keying into the broad strokes of the bison range itself. The sort of darker brown represents what was likely core bison range, basically primary bison range in mainly the central grasslands of the North American interior, mostly the mixed and short grass prairies of the Great Plains, where bison were most abundant and was sort of a stronghold. You'll notice though that there's this one in the lighter color, it's a peripheral bison range, kind of extending out on multiple sides of that core range for the plains bison. This was likely a sort of secondary bison range where the animals always existed at lower numbers, lower densities, might not have always been there, probably ebbed and flowed. And as you can see, they actually, bison extended deep into the eastern US in relatively recent centuries, which is really into the eastern sort of forest woodland realm, where we don't normally think of bison. They were probably occupying, open woodlands, tall grass prairie, stringers and peninsulas, flatwoods, the cane breaks along river floodplains. And as you can see, they very nearly appeared to reach the Gulf and even the Atlantic coast, although they, on the Atlantic side of things, they were probably mostly more common west of the Appalachians. Then on the western side, more pertinent to us, you can also see there's peripheral bison range extending into the Intermountain West, the Great Basin, the Columbia Plateau, down into the southwest into northern Mexico. And similarly, lower numbers of bison, lower densities maybe a more fleeting presence, but definitely part of the broadest North American bison range. One sort of theme that we see in some of the early Euro-American records, both on the east side and then later in the far west, is the sense that bison may have been expanding their range in historical times. And some of that is based on some indigenous knowledge that perhaps bison were kind of spreading about the time that Europeans arrived in North America. There are some theories why that might be. Bison, theme of bison range in general is that bison range in numbers have fluctuated significantly over prehistory and history, partly based on climate fluctuations. Also, it's important to remember that native North Americans were decimated by introduced exotic European diseases. The human population, the indigenous population in North America decreased significantly even before Europeans really started foraying into the continent, and that might have possibly lightened some hunting pressure on bison, may have allowed them to spread. Also important to note, though, that certainly in the East, bison probably benefited from native sculpting of the landscape through burning, for example, which probably kept many habitats more open than they otherwise would be. So let's drill down into Oregon specifically. There's a quote up top from William Hornaday in his sort of well-known work on bison, where he kind of reflected that notion that bison may have been in the process of expanding their range in the past few centuries, even speculating that possibly they could have spread westward and crossed the Cascade Sierra chains and maybe colonized the interior valleys of the Pacific slope, which is an interesting idea. Really, the go-to reference for bison in Oregon is a Portland State University thesis by Nicole Ann Stutty from 2004. And she really went through the known bison remains in the state over the past few thousand years. And it's a really great contribution to what we know about bison in the Intermountain West. A take-home kind of message basically is that about 2,000 years ago, there appeared to be an increase in bison abundance in Eastern Oregon. And that roughly syncs with some other findings, relatively recent work done in other parts of the Intermountain West, including the Snake River Plain in Idaho, the Mid-Columbia Basin, Palouse of Eastern Washington, other parts of the Great Basin outside of Oregon that similarly show roughly the same kind of pattern and timetable of an increase in bison over in the beginning about 2,000 years ago. Not saying that it's a crazy abundance of the animals, but definitely an increase in numbers. Her thesis also specifically in Oregon points to possibly a peak in bison population roughly 600 to 300 years ago. So this is a map by a guy named Cliff White, who is a researcher up in Canada, biologist, ecologist, and he's been doing some really fascinating work on the western range limits of bison. Fascinating kind of deep dive stuff where he's drawing from indigenous knowledge, Euro-American reports, sort of ecological insights. He's even using Google Earth analysis and some on-the-ground transects to look for historical bison wallows and other evidence. It's a little complicated map, but but it's important way to think about how bison may have reached Oregon in sort of historical times. The color coding is bison density, the red showing moderate to high bison density, as you can see on the Great Plains, again, that core range. And then, as you can see, kind of in the Snake River Plain into the Northern Great Basin and Columbia Plateau country, this yellow color indicating low to moderate bison density, and probably basically pretty low for the most part. The arrows are showing Cliff White's sort of speculations on possible bison movements from the plains toward the mountains and then into the mountains. This is based on some speculation that bison on the Great Plains may have moved in late summer and fall into more sheltered habitats that, at least in the western edge of the Great Plains, might have been the foothills of the Rockies, or at least along the Rocky Mountain front. And it kind of falls into this notion that he has of a three-phase movement pattern. So that first phase would have been the movement of bison from the plains toward the mountains, which might have been an annual movement. And these two-way arrows show that possibly shifting of range between the edge of the mountains and the interior of the plains. The second part of that phase might have been those bison that were close to the mountains, something compelling them to move westward into the Rockies. And there could have been many factors that would have compelled them to do so, including human hunting, for example, even possibly people chasing bison into the mountains where they were easily kind of corralled and boxed in. There might have been climate factors, hard winters, drought that might have forced bison into the mountains, or it's wandering buffalo. Basically, bison can cover a lot of ground, especially bulls, and maybe that they sort of were the vanguard of that movement periodically. The one-way arrows show this sort of notion that maybe bison were being forced or compelled one way or the other into the mountains and then into the Intermountain country. You'll see that kind of lower down in the U.S. Northern Rockies and Middle Rockies, the arrows penetrate deeper west, corresponding with that movement into the Intermountain West. The idea there from Cliff White is that there's some physiographic reasons down there that there are more isolated mountain blocks with basins and broad passes that separate those, with pretty extensive steppe vegetation that might have been conducive to bison moving through there, and also making them, because of the openness and broadness of those passes, making them less vulnerable to hunting. Farther north, some of the passes more constricted. Bison may have been more exposed to human hunting and less likely to penetrate deep into the mountains. South Pass down in Wyoming, along the Continental Divide, seemed to be particularly an important one, a relatively low sort of steppe land portal through the mountains that could have funneled bison into the upper Snake and into the upper Salmon drainages, as well as parts of the Great Basin. You also note there are, he's included names for native cultures. Important to note here that multiple cultures on the west side of the Rockies in the Intermountain West had a tradition of crossing the Rockies to hunt bison on the Great Plains, including the Nez Perce and Cayuse. That demonstrates their deep relationship with bison that continues today. It has occasionally been floated as evidence for against bison really being very prevalent west of the Rockies. But the more likely explanation, as this map kind of shows, is that west of the Rockies, bison generally were existing in lower numbers, smaller herds, much more scattered. And so people would opportunistically encounter these herds, definitely exploit them as food, but they were nothing to rely upon. And if you wanted to get bison, you would be probably crossing the mountains to the amazing bison range on the plains. There are some theories as to why bison in the Intermountain West might have been less numerous, more geographically restricted. And I won't go into all the details here in the interest of time, but basically there are some it is likely that bison, again, were existing in lower densities, smaller, more scattered herds for a variety of reasons, including environmental ones. And so those smaller, more scattered herds would be more vulnerable, certainly, to extreme climate events, human hunting. So you might have been seeing areas that had bison and there was a local die-off, and it might take a while for the herds to kind of be replenished. But in Cliff White's theory, that three-phase movement, the second phase, which I guess I didn't explain, was the movement of bison into the mountains. Third phase might have been bison that penetrated farther west and persisted in some form, maybe eventually dying out, maybe surviving in small numbers. Either way, probably being replenished historically by those plains bison periodically moving westward. Here are some pictures from Southeast Oregon showing some sites that are associated with relatively recent bison occupation. Catlow Valley, and not too far away, Malheur Lake. The Malheur Basin in general has quite a lot of, relatively speaking, quite a lot of bison remains. The Malheur Lake bed in about 1930, mostly dried up, and dozens, and depending on what reports you believe, maybe hundreds of bison skulls and associated skeletal remains were found there. So there seems to have been a center of bison abundance in the Great Basin of Oregon, maybe specifically in that Malheur Harney Lakes area. Quote from Ogden here from 1826, kind of reinforcing that idea that maybe bison had been there not too long before. But we know that bison also ranged elsewhere in Oregon, and as I said, up into the eastern Washington. In the upper left here, we have the foothills of the southeastern edge of the Grand Ronde Valley near the town of Union. There's a bison site. Bison bones were found in Union that date to maybe 200 to 1,000 years old. Down below, there's a picture by Rob Clavins of the Zumwalt Prairie. And there's Joseph Upland, which is west of Hell's Canyon, north of Wallowa Valley. A very fine example of bunchgrass prairie, the so-called Palouse prairie, that was historically much more widespread in the interior Northwest, and is related to similar bunchgrass communities in some of the Intermountain valleys in northwestern Montana, where bison were known to occupy. And up in the upper right here, we have the National Bison Range, which is in one of those very similar type Palouse style bunchgrass communities where bison are doing quite well. There are other reports of bison remains, also anecdotal evidence. Vic Coggins, who's a retired ODFW biologist over in Wallowa County, also Ralph Anderson of Wallowology there in Wallowa Valley have talked about possible bison wallows on the Joseph Upland. So there's a lot of, and anecdotally, I've also heard of plenty of bison remains that have been found since the Stutty's 2004 thesis. So lots still to delve into. Relevant to Oregon bison is this, potentially is this concept of mountain buffalo, which is sort of some of the early Euro-American travelers through the Rockies and westward. Many commented on the bison in the Rockies being somewhat different from those in the plains, maybe a little bit smaller, stockier, darker colored, and most sort of consistently very elusive, very wary, very flighty, and existing in quite small herds that were occupying often quite rugged terrain, which made them difficult to hunt. And these are some cool pictures from before 1894 of bison of Yellowstone bison in the Hayden Valley. Early travelers, commentators, defined the Yellowstone bison as an example of this mountain buffalo, so-called mountain buffalo. And so these are kind of cool pictures potentially of that form. Some commentators used to linked mountain bison with wood bison, actually, which is the boreal form of bison found in Canada and Alaska. But more likely, mountain bison, at least down in the U.S. Rockies and Intermountain West, were plains bison, genetically identical, but possibly an example of an ecotype. You know, populations of animals that were behaviorally, maybe a little morphologically adapted to specific distinctive habitats. This potentially relates to an interesting story we have from the Wallowa Mountains here in Northeast Oregon. There's in 1922, a Nez Perce man related that as a boy, which may have been in the mid 19th century, he had seen a herd of bison running into Steamboat Lake, which is a subalpine lake in the sort of northern core of the Wallowas. Not necessarily a landscape many of us associate with bison, but actually one that does link to some of those historical references to mountain bison. We get some further sort of perspective on mountain bison from today's Yellowstone herds, which seem to roughly follow that life way of that involves some vertical elevational migration on a seasonal basis. And perhaps that's what some Intermountain West bison were doing. They were moving up slope to access more productive forage later in the summer when some of the lower grassland and foothills had cured out. Another sort of interesting, another potential interesting insight into mountain bison comes from Banff National Park in Alberta, where bison were reintroduced just a couple of years ago. Those reintroduced bison very immediately and readily occupied pretty high elevation habitat. And some of the researchers who've been tracking those herds, reintroduced herds, have found historic wallows up there and also some bones, some old bones. One of which an isotope analysis suggested that the animal it came from, the bison it came from, likely spent most of its time in the mountains rather than going down into the plains to the east, which is another potential pattern those animals might have followed. So interesting insights. We also have some 19th century Paiute insights into the bison in the Malheur Lake area, possibly moving up into the mountains in the summertime and down into the basin in the winter. We don't exactly know when bison disappeared from Oregon. We know about that, or we think we have that sense of that peak abundance a few centuries ago. They were probably mostly gone from Oregon by 1800. There is an interesting account, multiple Euro-American accounts from the Snake River Plain, which is always a fairly important bison spot in the Intermountain West, that in the roughly the mid 1820s to 1830s, there was some kind of increase or pulse of bison westward on the plain, farther west than they had recently been seen, west of today's Twin Falls. And that may correspond with some reports from Oregon at the same time. Vic Coggins, in his book, Memoirs of a Backcountry Bio, references some newspaper accounts that suggest in the 1810s or 1820s, there may have been a herd of bison in the Grand Ronde Valley in Northeast Oregon, maybe some reports from the Columbia and Snake Rivers. That interesting to think if that corresponded maybe with that westward movement from the Snake River Plain, which might have been, we can speculate, could have been a late or even the last example of that westward pulse dispersal that Cliff White talks about into the Intermountain, deeper into the Intermountain West. Bison appear to have been basically gone from the Snake River Plain by about 1840. There were some lone wandering bulls that showed up in some parts in the Intermountain West, in Wyoming, in Utah. Interesting to think about. Were there some solitary buffalo that held on a while in Oregon, even a remnant herd? So the current picture of bison is, the conservation picture is better than it was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the animal was almost extirpated or exterminated. But it is, many of the herds today are small. I mean, they're widely distributed in private and public herds. but many are basically domesticated, semi-domesticated. Quite a few have some cattle genetic introgression, which makes sort of wild, mostly free-roaming, large herds of pure bison all the more precious. And so we can think, as some have proposed, that another aspect of really preserving bison today and expanding bison is trying to restore them to habitats where they're gone and ecological landscapes where they're gone, maybe those ecotypes that once existed. One researcher, James Bailey, has even proposed Malheur National Wildlife Refuge as a potential place to someday restore the sort of far west ecotype of bison. Definitely have to emphasize that the tribal efforts are hugely important and very active in restoring bison and restoring relationships with bison. Intertribal Buffalo Council has many member tribes in the US, including the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla here in Northeast Oregon. We're going to roll right into grizzly bears, which we know more about to some extent in Oregon, which were more widespread. There appear to be that many more indigenous and Euro-American place names relating to the grizzlies that does reflect a broader distribution and a decent population size. Here's a old map from the 30s from Vernon Bailey showing a rough historical grizzly range in Oregon. Probably, again, roughly accurate. We do know that grizzlies were on the southwestern coast, which he does not show. Whether grizzlies were much in the coast range northward and the immediate coast, that's a little bit of an open question, and a good example of Euro-American reports are pretty mostly consistent, saying they weren't particularly abundant or maybe were entirely absent. But there's where traditional indigenous knowledge can really come into play. Certainly grizzlies occupy similar temperate rainforest habitats in coastal British Columbia and Alaska, and historically did in California. But you can see they were otherwise distributed in the Cascades, down into the Klamaths, the Blue Mountain Province. And interestingly, there were grizzlies in southeast Oregon on the margins of the Great Basin, apparently Steens Mountain, the Oahe Uplands. David Mattson, who I mentioned before, who's a longtime grizzly bear researcher, did a lot of work for the federal government in Yellowstone on grizzlies, has done a lot of work as an independent researcher, and is doing some really cool stuff on reconstructing the deep history of grizzlies and historical ecology of the bears where they're no longer found. He's suggested that it's possible around 1800 Oregon might have had north of 4,000 grizzly bears in those general regions. Here are some maps by David Mattson showing the basic picture of the decline and local extirpation of regional extirpations of grizzly bears in the 19th and 20th centuries. You can see that grizzlies in Oregon likely held on pretty well into the mid 19th century. And then as Euro-American settlement expanded, as in most places, grizzlies really dropped off. By 1910 and the early decades of the 20th century, grizzlies were probably in Oregon mostly confined to the Northeast and to the Southern Cascades and Klamaths. And by 1970, as you can see, they had vanished from Oregon. There's plenty of stories about grizzlies in Oregon when they were around. A very brief random sampling from Western Oregon, David Douglas, the pioneering botanist, who many of you may know. In 1826, he went through the Willamette Valley and down into the Umpqua, looking for the sugar pine, actually. And he had multiple run-ins with grizzlies and saw plenty of grizzly evidence. One of the hunters in his party was actually attacked by a grizzly bear in the vicinity of Albany, Oregon today. And Douglas himself shot a grizzly cub in the Umpqua country, not too far from Roseburg. Louis Labont, 1830s, talked about seeing grizzlies at French Prairie in the Willamette Valley. definitely the Willamette was grizzly habitat not crazy long ago. And here's a historic picture of a hunter with some grizzly hides in Joseph here in Northeast Oregon from Jerry Gildemeister's archives. We know from existing grizzly populations and similar ecosystems and ecoregions, and also from a pretty well documented grizzly lifeway in California, where grizzlies were quite abundant. We get some insights into what kind of habitats and food sources they were using in Oregon. Don't necessarily have time to go into detail, but it's pretty amazing to think about grizzly bear really embraces the landscape like very few other animals, going up and down in elevation, exploiting all kinds of food sources, phenological rhythms, both animal and plant foods. So grizzlies really, when they were here, were surely utilizing a lot of different habitats in Oregon. Special note on the right there, the chaparral from the Oregon Siskiyous. Grizzlies in California were deeply associated with chaparral. Grizzly trails through the brush, even some dens deep into thickets. So really great bear habitat. In terms of food, David Matson, for one thing, has done a lot of work reconstructing probable historical grizzly diets, but suffice it to say that Oregon was an extremely good place, or much of Oregon was an extremely good place to be a grizzly bear. Diverse berry crops, huckleberries, thimbleberries, devil's club, salmonberry, serviceberry. The fish runs, once incredibly bountiful salmonid fish runs, were surely attended to by Oregon's grizzlies. Cow parsnip, digging up biscuit root bulbs and yampa. We've got a picture of an acorn here in Western Oregon. Grizzlies would have surely feasted heavily on acorns as they did in California. Reports from California of when acorns were ripe, grizzlies the oak groves and savannas were crawling with grizzlies, essentially busting down branches to feast on the nuts. Kind of a dicey time to be traveling through landscapes. And similar stories about madrone and, as this quote says, about plums, wild plums. Also going up into the high country, certainly on the eastern side of the Cascades in Northeast Oregon too, probably to feast on whitebark pine nuts. And then in the Maritime Klamaths, or possibly on farther north on the Oregon coast, bears surely were tapping into marine resources as they did in California, as they still do farther north up the coast, including as here in Alaska, scavenging whale carcasses, which would have been a real bonanza. We know that from California that many bears would come out and scavenge baleen whales, but also all kinds of other beach rack and mussels, crabs, kelp. So we, California grizzlies were pretty famous for being quite large, at least in places kind of on the order of Alaskan brown bears, roughly, well north of 1,000 pounds potentially. And we can suspect that certainly in Southwest Oregon, probably grizzlies were pretty hefty too, because they had an amazingly diverse, high quality spectrum of foods, not least those the acorns, which are really high in fat, and also, of course, the salmon, steelhead runs. So probably some big bears, including this one. Quick run through of the close of the original grizzly chapter in Oregon. This is probably the most famous, or one of the most famous Oregon grizzlies. Reelfoot also ranged into Northern California in the late 19th century. Was known for preying on livestock, which many late grizzlies in their lower 48 range were forced to do, and also for eluding hunters, eventually killed in 1890, not far from Pilot Rock. Here are some pictures also from the Jerry Gildemeister archives of a government hunter in Northeast Oregon at Billy Meadows vicinity in Wallowa County, showing some grizzly hides in about 1908. And we know that grizzlies did hold on in Northeast Oregon fairly late. Speaking of, here are some dates that we do have for some of the last grizzlies. 1931, widely cited, a grizzly killed along Chestnut Creek in Wallowa County. There apparently were some bears holding on in the Southern Cascades, Klamaths. The ones that I know of, any kind of documentation, were a pair of grizzlies in the far western Wallowas in the Minam drainage that were killing livestock. One was shot, and this picture actually shows the basic area that those grizzlies were active in, and also where that bear was killed. The other one we don't know of being actually killed, but definitely vanished. We still have plenty of grizzly sightings in Northeast Oregon reported. It's complicated because many of our black bears out here are brown, or blonde, or cinnamon phase. Here's some very award-winning shots I've taken of Northeast Oregon brown phase black bears, and you can see that even if you know your grizzly versus black bear ID marks, it can still be challenging if you only got a glimpse. So probably a lot of those alleged sightings are black bears, but some have come from pretty reputable sources. So who knows? Quick run through of the potential future. These are some U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service maps showing the official grizzly bear recovery zones in the lower 48. Relatively close ones to Oregon being the North Cascades, the Selkirks, and the Bitterroots, where we don't know of a breeding population of grizzlies, but as this map on the right, which actually shows sort of potential current range of grizzlies, including dispersing from their core range, suggests bears have been kind of edging into the Bitterroots in recent years, including a grizzly caught on trail camera in 2019 near Grangeville, Idaho. And the following year, last year, some tracks in the same area confirmed. That's really not very far east from, and it's sort of in the Clearwater Mountains. It's not far east from Hell's Canyon and the Oregon border. Here's a picture looking into Hell's Canyon from the eastern Wallowas, and just that's the likeliest gateway for grizzlies to reoccupy the state, as gray wolves and to some extent wolverines have maybe done, and also where a lot of the sightings have been reported. I'm going to quickly end on this note. I've talked about grizzlies and bison separately, but it's I think interesting and important to reflect on that those two animals have a deep relationship in North America. Grizzlies arrived probably 70,000 years ago, and for most of that history lived alongside bison, scavenged bison. And that's a relationship that basically is almost vanished. They overlap hardly anywhere. This is a picture from Yellowstone. That's one of the significant holdouts for that relationship. And bison are an important component of grizzly diet there, and a preserve for that sort of ancient relationship. And that's it. I want to give a few thanks to people who have provided some information and counsel on the subject. And here's a probably too cluttered list of some of those sources I mentioned that you should definitely check out if you're at all interested in learning more. And happy to answer any questions or try.
Well, thanks, Ethan. Really appreciate it. I'm going to do just a quick 5-minute presentation here, and then we'll jump into questions. So let me share my screen real quick. Great. Can you see that as well? Lovely. Okay. And yeah, I will not take up too much of time, but I just wanted to give folks, especially if you're new to Oregon Wild, a sense of our organization and our wildlife program, and how you can get involved in and plug into the work that we do. So if you've heard my presentation before, just bear with us and go fill up your drink, come back, and we'll get to Q&A in just a few minutes. So again, we're Oregon Wild. We're a state-based conservation organization working to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters for an enduring legacy for all Oregonians. And I am the wildlife program coordinator. And so obviously my focus is on wildlife and habitat issues in Oregon. I am not a biologist. I don't unfortunately get to go out and be with the wildlife. I do more of the advocacy for the wildlife and for conservation and protection measures to make sure that they're able to recover and thrive in the state. And so, you know, there's obviously a number of species in the state, and I'm only one person. So I just want to give folks an understanding of kind of how we choose and decide on different programs and species to work on, because there's just too many to choose from. And so I call it the conservation of the keystones, of course, and their habitat. And what I mean by that is, I'm sure many folks are aware of an ecological keystone species. So, you know, it has an overriding importance on the surrounding environment and ecosystem. Usually without its presence, we see almost ecological collapse. So common keystone species that a lot of folks talk about are gray wolves, our sea otters, our beavers. So of course, you know, we're working to restore those species here in Oregon as well. But I also want to touch on two other sort of keystone species or types of keystone species that how I use to categorize my work, which is political keystone species and social keystone species. So what I mean by that with a political keystone species is that, we work on species that have an opportunity to sort of bridge other issues. And so that, you know, they might be oftentimes politically contentious, but they also give us an opportunity to not only talk about that individual species, but perhaps larger habitat issues or things related to the entire ecosystem, perhaps not just that particular species. And so what I mean, here's an example, is the northern spotted owl. This is a species we care greatly about because it nests in old growth forests. It sort of automatically pulls in an ability to talk about these bigger issues that we need to address. And so we sometimes categorize our program by these political keystone species. And then finally, we have social keystone species, which are species that members of the public get really excited about. It's often the charismatic megafauna. I'd love to think that everybody will get up every day and be so stoked to, go storm the Capitol about every species in Oregon. But the fact of the matter is there are certain species that get people really enthusiastic and energized to go do advocacy. And so, we think about all of these different components when we work on our programs. Often harnessing that public energy is really important because even as an advocate, I know that it's really difficult as an individual to pass conservation measures. We need the whole public and that grassroots pressure to really show up. So we think about that when we're thinking about, campaigns to protect wildlife in Oregon. And then within that, I kind of have two buckets of how I think about our wildlife protection work. So we have sort of the species that are here that might be on decline, might be on the brink of extinction. And so we're working toward restoration, recovery of those species. To name a few: wolves, beavers, marbled murrelet, wolverine, northern spotted owl, salmon, many more. And then there's species that we're working to reintroduce that are now missing from the landscape or the seascape for too many years for a number of reasons, and they're a missing link. And so we have programs to actually look at reintroducing species. So two of them would be sea otters and California condors. We're not the lead on those efforts, but we're doing what we can to help ensure that these species are able to return. And then, how we advocate for these different species is, through a myriad of ways, but these are sort of the common places where policies and decisions around fish and wildlife are made, which is the state legislature, the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission. And I would like to say that, before I even worked on wildlife, it didn't even dawn on me that that's probably the most important decision-making body in Oregon for fish and wildlife. And so that's a place where you can find us quite often, of course, at the federal level with Congress, and then with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well at the federal level. And then the thing, and I can never hit this enough, which is, we can't do the work we do without the support of the public. You know, thinking about the legislature, for example, you know, what they respond to is constituent pressure and passion on particular issues. So I'm always making a plug for folks to get involved with Oregon Wild, to get involved with our wildlife advocacy program. And so ways you can do that is, if you're not already on our Oregon Wild list, please do that. We also have a sub list called the Wolf Pack, and it covers wolves and other wildlife issues. I typically send out a newsletter just once a month, but it usually has ways you can get engaged, take action, you know, what have you. You know, just continuing to learn about opportunities to advocate for wildlife, wildland, and water. If there's opportunities to write in public and submit public comment on important policies, that's a great way to show your care. Of course, meet with elected officials, whether it's with an official lobby day effort or on your own. These folks work for you. They want to hear what you have to say. So don't be afraid to just ask for a meeting with your elected official, whether it's at the local level, state level, federal level. Of course, share actions on social media so we can create a movement around these particular things. And if the mood strikes you, write a letter to the editor so that we can be getting out information in the newspapers. So I just wanted to always make a plug for how we do our work and give you all a snapshot of sort of the different programs we have within the wildlife work, how we do it, and how you all can plug in. So now we can move to questions for me and Ethan. Thanks, Allie.
All right, so we have a few minutes for questions, so I'll get started right away. The first one is, are there other areas where bison remains or evidence have been found in Oregon besides the Great Basin and the Grand Ronde Valley?
Yeah, there have been for sure, including the Oregon portion of the sort of Columbia Basin, the Deschutes Umatilla Plateau, and quite far. There are remains from the edge of Klamath Marsh as well, pretty widely distributed in the eastern part of the state, and then again, quite a few sites in eastern Washington as well. And down into parts of the Great Basin outside of Oregon. So yeah, the Great Basin seemed to be some kind of center where they held out, but yeah, other parts of the state east of the Cascades, definitely.
Thanks, Ethan. The next one is, could you give us a perspective on how much larger those ancestral bison were compared to our living bison?
Yeah, well, the prehistoric bison were significantly bigger. I mean, the giant longhorn bison was, you know, a few times, you know, maybe 2 or 3 times larger than a modern bison. And as I said, basically there was a downward trend in size with as we kind of grade into modern bison. And there's been some interesting research lately that I mean, a lot of that was probably induced by climate change, and there is some evidence that bison are getting smaller currently from kind of warmer, more demanding conditions. So who knows what that means for the future of modern bison? But yeah, significantly bigger. They were big animals.
Wow, that's definitely interesting to think about. What is the likelihood that grizzlies will return to Oregon on their own?
I mean, hard to say. As with all this stuff, I would imagine it's about, I mean, getting those core populations nearby, as in central Idaho, restoring that, which, you know, is very high quality habitat, large, roadless complex, and then, you know, but you need the corridors as well, obviously, which is partly what's limited grizzlies recolonizing that Bitterroot country. So if the corridors are there, I mean, there's plenty of wildland between there and Hell's Canyon, and then, you know, who knows? So, and young male grizzlies, especially, as with a lot of carnivores, do tend to roam about. Although there was a female grizzly several years ago, that did an amazingly long journey through Montana and Idaho, including into the Bitterroots. So they'll cover some ground, and who knows? But yeah, be cool to see.
Yeah, I was curious about that too. As you were talking, I was just thinking, are they known to be wide dispersers? Do they go far distances? So yeah, hearing that is interesting. Thanks.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah.
This one is also related to grizzlies. But could you talk more about what a grizzly's year might have looked like in Oregon?
Yeah, I mean, I had to kind of skim over some of that habitat food source stuff, but it is interesting to think about in different parts of Oregon how grizzlies might have been, what their sort of yearly round might have been, and obviously things like fish runs would have partly dictated where they might have been foraging. Basically, grizzlies emerging from their winter dens are going for early green up of vegetation that's easy to digest for them. They certainly would be berries in much of the state would have been a big midsummer to late summer, early fall draw, and then, yeah, I mean, spring and fall, maybe digging bulbs and roots to kind of get by. But as David Mattson, who I referenced, sort of emphasizes, berries, tree mast, which would be acorns and also white bark pine nuts, fish runs, even in much of the Grizzly Range, I mean, scavenging, winter killed animals, maybe more in the eastern side of the state. The sort of meat and berries and nuts are meat, including fish, are really the sort of high-powered, some of the high-powered food sources that bears would have been seeking out up and down the landscape during their active season. And then denning, who knows, I mean, bears in the Rockies den high up on sort of often northeast facing slopes. Like I said, there were reports from California of grizzlies denning in really thick chaparral. So interesting to think of where they were spending the winters in Oregon as well.
All right, this one is probably more directed towards Danielle. But what Oregon tribes are working on reintroducing keystone species? I know the Nez Perce and Wallowas are working on salmon species as well as condors.
Yeah, great question. And I definitely can't speak to every tribe and every species, but one that we're closely tied to is the potential reintroduction of sea otters, which is being led by an organization called the Alaka Alliance. Alaka actually being Chinook jargon for sea otter. And it was founded by a Siletz tribal member, and now is a consortium of lots of tribes and nonprofits and other folks. So they're exploring and in the process of doing sort of a feasibility study on sea otter restoration on the coast. It sounds like there's some efforts with Klamath tribes on beavers and suckers and lots of other fish species. And yeah, the Yurok tribe as well, as which they're not necessarily in Oregon specifically, but they actually just got their final sort of permitting approval from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to also return California condor on their ancestral lands. And given that they're so far in Northern California, that's likely that condor would also return to Oregon. It could be days after that. So that's another one that has an impact in Oregon.
Thank you. And then in terms of bison, you mentioned some theories on limitations to bison occupation of the Intermountain West. Can you talk a little bit more about these?
Yeah, I mean, real briefly, people have, for decades, there's sort of been debate about whether and bison were much west of the Rockies and why they might have been limited, including climate issues, differences between the composition and sort of phenology of grassland and shrub steppe habitats in the Intermountain West versus the Great Plains. And also extreme climate events like droughts and heavy snows, heavy crusted snow, and just sort of the terrain of the Intermountain West, like in the inland Northwest. There's a lot of rugged, there's canyons, mountain ranges, bison habitat. Optimum bison habitat would not have been necessarily so continuous as you would have on the prairies east of the Rockies. But again, we know they did get out here, and probably those were factors potentially limiting bison, along with human hunting. But maybe it was a case of just generally lower numbers of bison, more scattered, and like I said, a bad winter, a drought, a hunting, event could have, locally wiped out bison at that kind of population level. But again, probably supplemented from the east periodically to keep them as a occasional presence, at least.
Awesome. So there are still quite a few people logged on, so I'll just ask one final question before wrapping it all up. So the last question is, what can members of the public do to help support the recovery of these iconic species in Oregon?
Ethan, I don't know if you have specific efforts that underway for the particular species you're covering. I mean, obviously, getting involved with organizations that are looking at this, like Oregon Wild, and are going to share with you opportunities when they arise to weigh in and have members of the public engaged. That I think that's first and foremost, so you don't miss the opportunities as they're coming up. Just like what's happening with condor and sea otters, we definitely alert our members when these opportunities arise to support it. So, but I don't know if you have. You can speak to Ethan to like specifically what's going on the recovery of those species. We at Oregon Wild we've sort of talked very abstractly about a grizzly program, but we're, I think, waiting to see what happens in Washington first, and just, yeah, there's more effort that needs to be pulled together. But
yeah, I'm not very familiar with active efforts just myself. That might be my own limited knowledge, but certainly, yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on in Washington, grizzly bear wise. Also, again, Idaho. I know it's been floated in California. Even the idea of reintroducing grizzlies. California was just pretty obviously a really productive place to be a grizzly bear. Oregon as well. So I don't know of active efforts, and nor with bison, but certainly the more that we can piece together about their histories here, that could lay a groundwork. But there's plenty more work to be done, as I said, including definitely with input from the tribal people as well. So
thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Danielle and Ethan. This was a very interesting webcast, but we are definitely out of time now. So yes, thank you to everyone in the audience for tuning in, and have a good night.
Thanks, Sally.
all right, thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
All right.